Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, as little as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcast, our complete newsletter, and all of our exclusive religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormon Land. Now for today's show. For today's faithful, believing, temple recommend carrying members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sipping a Chardonnay with their salmon entree would be unthinkable, off the table, a no-no. They know that the faith's Word of Wisdom health code strictly forbids consumption of alcohol. But there was a time in the church's history when teetotaling wasn't the order of the day. In fact, there was a time when Latter-day Saints not only drank wine, but also produced it, sold it, and profited from it, all with their profits, blessing, and encouragement. Indeed, southwestern Utah's pioneer past was home to a church, quote, wine mission. We're going to talk about that era today with Lindsay Hansen Park, a blogger, podcaster, and executive director of the Sunstone Education Foundation. Lindsay, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Lindsay, set the scene for our listeners. What was this wine mission, and why was the church not only okay with it, but pushing it back then?
So many people don't know that today in the cornerstone of the St. George Temple is a bottle of Dixie wine. And if you're like me or Dennis Lancaster, who wrote about this, when you find that out, you're like, wait, what? Because I come from a generation where, like you said, wine is forbidden. In fact, in our household, wine is akin to murder. I mean, it's very, very, very serious. And so it's interesting to learn that there was a whole culture of wine in southern Utah for almost a century, and it still lingers today. There's actually a vibrant wine culture sort of growing again. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, Utah has a very storied past when it comes to wine.
How was the Word of Wisdom seen within the church at that time, though? It's not like it is now, for instance.
No, so the Word of Wisdom for Mormons started in 1833 in D&C 89. And there's a line in there that talks about wine being allowed, permitted, but from your own make. You have to make it yourselves. And so Mormons, that's how they would have understood it. So even though there was this culture of moving away from drinking, that had to do with public drunkenness and moral, failings. If you got drunk, then you were seen as sort of weak. But wine was used for medicine, it was used for social events, and it was used for communion or sacrament.
Mm-hmm. So how did Brigham Young, the president of the church at that time, view alcohol consumption, especially wine? And did he drink?
So Brigham Young did drink. He actually had a favorite winemaker in Middleton, Utah, that he would stop by every time he went to southern Utah. He would go and get one glass of wine and a sandwich. And I think that I like that story because it shows the one glass of wine. He was very principled about it, and he wanted others to be too. So he believed you could drink wine, that wine had a purpose in your life, but it often got out of control. And when it did, he didn't respect that. And that's sort of the struggle that we'll see in this history as it gets out of control. Brigham Young says, okay, I think you guys can't handle this anymore. But Brigham Young could. He had his own private collection of alcohol, not just wine. A lot of it was used for medicinal purposes. He liked whiskey as well. Brigham Young was a whiskey drinker. Mm-hmm. And up in the north, they made what they call Valley Tan, which was a really strong whiskey that the leather tanners made because they didn't have coopers. They had sent the coopers down to southern Utah to make wine.
So why was the Dixie wine mission so successful when cotton, silk, and other crops Brigham wanted the southern Utah settlers to try? Those crops didn't work so well.
That's right. Well, the latitude in southern Utah is, if you look at it, it's right where some of the most famous vineyards in Italy are, it's at the same latitude. So when the Mormons send, explorers down to southern Utah, they're first exploring the idea of cotton. Cotton fails pretty quickly. They try iron. That doesn't work. But they're exploring and they're like, wait a minute, grapes are growing really well. And then they send an expedition in 1855 to Las Vegas, and they see these old grapes growing from the Spanish missions many years prior that have now been abandoned. And they're like, wait, the grapes are still growing. So right away, they realize this is a successful crop to grow there, and they decide to grow it in earnest.
And you already alluded to this, but wine at that time was used in the church's sacrament or communion, right?
Yeah. So at this time, what they would do is they would pour wine in a goblet and they would pass the goblet down the aisle. And what I think is funny is, as I always say, they were growing wine and they were growing alcoholics, because as more people got addicted to wine down there, you have stories of people taking the whole glass of wine and it causing a problem. And that's eventually why Brigham Young moves to the individual cups in 1869, because he's like, I'm so tired of people abusing this wine goblet. You know, some people, it's rumored, would only show up to communion, like teenage boys, and then they would drink their wine and then go. So, it was wine in the communion for a long time. And then they had to change water or wine back to water.
So they went to the individual cups because of the wine consumption.
So in 1869,
they still use wine in little cups.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
It wasn't until the late 1880s that they moved to water. So because even that didn't stop the problems with wine. But before 1869, they were using goblets and they would pass that around, and then they invent the little cups to sort of ration the wine. And then in the 1880s, they've learned that doesn't help.
Very healthy either to, share germs like that.
Yeah. Pre-COVID. Yeah. They weren't thinking that at the time.
Everything was communal back then.
That's right. So how did Dixie wine compared to other wines? Was it considered of good quality? Was it potent?
So it depends on who you ask. If you ask
Which is
Mormons,
typical for anyone asking about wine.
Mormons were very proud of it. And from the get-go, they were interested in, once they realized they had the right soil and right conditions, they were really interested in making it their primary export. It was going to be their thing. And so they sent several men out to different places in California or in the East Coast to get the best seeds and to see which variety was good. And so they were proud of this, and they said it was very sweet and very tart. But if you ask the Gentiles, the non-Mormons who they sold it to in the mining camps of like Silver Reef, they said it was the strongest wine they've ever had. And that there's all these like apocryphal stories of drinking one drink and then passing out. So it just depends.
So you've already alluded to this, but did the Dixie Wine Mission lead to alcoholism and problem drinking?
So it did. And that's the hard part of this, because there's this whole culture that's really, I think, endearing and wonderful. They had songs about it and superstitions about it that I think are really fun and playful. But a lot of people used it to sort of drink away their troubles. And there were a lot of troubles when you're a colonizer, in southern Utah. It was a hard life. And so a lot of people became addicted to alcohol. And especially in southern Utah, it became a culture of it. There's stories of young men crashing wagons and, accidentally setting things on fire and causing public ruckus. And those are some of the public things. But then you have to think of what we know about alcoholism today. It's one of the main instigators to abuse in the home. And a lot of the issues that we see around, domestic violence and things like that, that was happening to these people in southern Utah. And so there are many instances where the High Council, of course, who were running, in Utah back then, I always like to say, where you had a sheriff, it was your bishop in Mormon Utah. So the church was running the legal happenings happening in southern Utah. And a lot of it has to do with public drunkenness, alcoholism, abuse. And so the leaders of the church realize pretty quickly that this is causing a secondary issue. And so right away, they start this campaign with sermons to try to get people to cut back on the wine. And there becomes a cultural campaign to show that anyone that abuses alcohol or gets drunk is seen as lesser. And eventually in the 1880s, you see men stop getting callings in the church because of their inability to stay sober.
What about young people? And was there a limit was there an age limit then? In others, you're not supposed to drink alcohol till you get a certain age. And what lengths did young people go to get wine? Besides going to the sacrament meeting, as you talked about.
It was cultural in the sense that they knew that it was too young for some children, but they would give it as medicine. So children were used to getting it as medicine. But there wasn't an age limit. There was superstitions. For example, there was one about pregnant women, that pregnant women should not drink because if they did, their child would be a drunkard. But that was the science. Mm-hmm. So there are stories of young boys who are, there's this great story of these 12-year-old boys who they realize that the liquor is being kept in the tithing house as tithing.
Which is interesting in its own right, right?
For a long time in Washington County, they were collecting wine as tithing and then and producing it also. And so the boys decide to siphon it, and they have the story where they form this train of 12-year-old boys down into the well, and they're literally taking a sip and passing it through their mouth to each other so they could get drunk. There's another story of young boys that it was a common practice that the local band in the town would go from house to house and play music on a holiday or whatever, and you would give them wine as a thank you. Well, there's a story of a young boys band of young kids about 13 or 14 that go around serenading, and they come home super drunk and their parents are like, what? You're not supposed to give our kids wine. So definitely kids weren't supposed to, but it was a sort of a looser culture.
Did any high level church leaders have drinking problems?
For sure. We know that Joseph F. Smith had an alcoholic problem. He actually got drunk and abused his wife. In a quite famous story. I think Steve Taysom talks about that in his book. Mm-hmm. Heber J. Grant was addicted to beer. And so one of his stories was he had to go dry out. And it's said that modern word of wisdom really comes from his experiences, knowing what that was like. But yeah, all the church leaders, every single church leader back then would have had wine. In fact, it was a sign of status. The wealthy people had 3 pitchers on their table: wine, milk, and water. And if you were poor, you just had wine. And so I think it was just part of the culture. It's so different for us to envision now, but it was very normal.
So what caused the end of the wine mission?
I think the problems we're talking about, the drunkenness. I think it was part of that. And part of it was the cash crop failed as the railroad comes in and we have more non-Mormons coming into town. They start brewing their own wine. And actually, Mormons kind of did this to themselves. So before, the territorial legislature had to say, we are going to give you this permit to brew wine. But then people started doing it in their homes. And it started this sort of underground black market where people would have their own wines that they would sell, and it watered down the market. And as soon as the mining towns got into it, the church lost control of the cash crop, and they switched their interest to other things. And when the railroad comes in, it changes the entire economy.
So I'm kind of wondering about a chicken and an egg question. Did the drinking problem, which led to partly getting rid of the wine mission, lead to the change in how the church viewed alcohol under the word of wisdom? Or did the changes in the word of wisdom under alcohol come and lead to the change in the wine mission and that going away? In other words, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So early
which came first, and what's the progression?
In Joseph Smith's day, a lot of people don't realize that Joseph Smith was drinking from an early age. So one of his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, actually ran a beer and cake shop. That was very normal for the time. And so there are stories of Joseph Smith getting drunk and prophesying when he's drunk. Sidney Rigdon, when he partners with Sidney Rigdon really gets on the political landscape of getting rid of alcohol. I mean, it was considered a moral problem for the reasons we talked about. When people got drunk, sometimes it wasn't pretty for people. So it was really Sidney Rigdon that tried to bring in this idea that alcohol was bad. But even for Joseph Smith's time, it was, in moderation. Mm-hmm. And Brigham Young, I think, carries that attitude with him. But as he starts to see how it affects his own men, I mean, there are stories of stake presidents and bishops in southern Utah who show up on the job too drunk to work and to do their job. And so it's affecting efficiency. And if there's something that Brigham Young despised, was lack of efficiency. And so I think that was the thing that sort of caused it. But again, it was part of the culture until it wasn't. But it took many decades for it to leave the Mormon culture. When
did wine become, for instance, drinking alcohol become, say, part of the temple recommend question or things like that?
Heber J. Grant is really responsible for bringing it into the modern church. But in southern Utah, it took a lot longer because it really was cultural. And I love the story of Juanita Brooks. And I don't know if this makes it in the article, but Juanita Brooks talks about when she's around 8 years old, she's at her grandmother's house and she has a stomach ache, and her grandmother gives her some like cherry cordial to help her stomach ache. And Juanita gets drunk really fast. And so she says in a drunken accent to her grandma, when I get older, I'm going to be a drunkard just like you or something like that. And her grandma is so horrified. She calls in Juanita's dad, and Juanita's dad, Henry, sits her down and says, look, there are some people who can take it and some who can't, and you can't. So, and that would have been in the 10s and 20s. I think up until the 1940s, it was considered okay. And coffee took a lot longer because that was a cultural thing as well.
Right.
And tea as well, especially in Southern Utah.
Right. And what you're referring to, the article referring to is by Mark Eddington about the wine mission. And you can find that at sltrip.com.
So obviously the whole country was turning against alcohol because we're talking about Prohibition era in the 20s. Do you think that had any impact on the church?
So by the late 1890s, the church officially stops all church production because up until then, the church was manufacturing alcohol. So it's kind of out of the business, but they still have very prominent, liquor makers and winemakers that are Mormon. When Prohibition happens, it becomes a real struggle here. And think about it. It was still a very libertarian, they wouldn't have used that word, but libertarian attitude where they didn't want government encroachment. And so it was a struggle for a lot of Mormons to give up brewing their liquor. And so a lot of them went on the underground, and there was an underground, speakeasy, like mobster running, but Mormon here in Utah for a while. And when the church found out about it, they did try to, adhere to the laws, but it was tricky. There are some instances of people being asked by the government to stop or losing their permits to brew and being very resentful and causing sort of a faith crisis. And some of the most prominent brewers shut down too. And one of them was a Jacob Horowitz. I think I'm remembering that right. He was a Jewish brewer that had started early in the frontier period, and his company had gone for many, many times. In fact, he's the guy that is the, urban legend Emo's Grave. If you've heard of Emo's Grave, it's because he's a Jewish non-Mormon brewer. So all the bad things that Mormon kids would have grown up with. So there is a struggle of like, do we follow the government or not? And I would say what was happening in the country was also happening in Utah.
So, Lindsay, what do you think modern Latter-day Saints can learn from this mission, this historic mission? Why would knowing about it be helpful to modern Mormons?
I think there's a rigidity that at least my generation grew up with. I think it's better for younger generations now who are growing up in the church. But we tend to get really black and white about these issues and orthodox and think that, drinking wine is akin to being a murderer. And it's not. I mean, the reason why Brigham Young and other church leaders gave this up, it was mostly a practical issue. And the morality in it became a lack of self-control and what you did when you were out of control. It wasn't that the wine itself was inherently evil or the devil was evil. Or the devil was in the wine. It was the wine was in the person the devil was in the person and the wine brought that out. And I think that it's the rigidity that gets us into trouble. Alcoholism is still a problem with some Latter-day Saints. And there's so much shame and stigma. And again, the moral failing isn't touching the wine itself. It's what you do with it. And so to me, the lesson is we like to ascribe these sort of rigid, moral, godlike things to rules like this. And that's not what it was ever about.
So do you think if more Latter-day Saints knew about the wine mission or how the word of wisdom evolved from a recommendation to kind of a dictate, do you think it would change how modern Latter-day Saints see the word of wisdom? Do you think the word of wisdom itself is changing?
I think so. I mean, I was just sitting with a bunch of BYU students just the other day, and they were all ordering coffee like it was nothing. And again, my generation, it was very black and white. So I'm like, how? It's like murder. What are you doing? I do. And I think that flexibility is good. I think that that's a healthy thing. Juanita Brooks, to recall her again, she talks about having our intellectual independence. And I think that people should make their own choices about this. That said, there's this other side of the coin where I see a lot of ex-Mormon people who lose their faith and then they're like, wine, alcohol, it's good. Like I've been lied to about it my whole life. And then they sort of go off the deep end. And I've seen too many people get lost in that. And I've seen some ex-Mormons turn to alcoholics very quickly because we don't have good rules and boundaries around it. So I think what is true now was true then, which is in moderation, there's probably nothing wrong with it. It's when, like Juanita Brooks's father said, some can take it and some can't. And sometimes you don't know. And the people I think that get in the most danger are the ones that think they can take it and can't. And it's just a hard, tricky thing.
And one last question, Lindsay, and globally now, the faith, I mean, some of these prescriptions in the Word of Wisdom are very ingrained in different cultures, Africa and obviously Europe and Asia, everywhere. Do you think the global church, as it expands, especially in the global South, will increase pressure to change things how the Word of Wisdom is taught, I guess?
Probably just like everything else. I mean, there are still parts of the world where people are drinking alcohol because it's cleaner and safer sometimes than water sources. And so I think that that's a consideration that we don't always think about when we, are sitting in our homes in Utah or whatever. I also think that issues like coffee is interesting. That's deeply cultural for a lot of people, but so are, things like marijuana. To me, that's the most interesting Word of Wisdom shifting that's happening, psychedelics and marijuana. It's been so interesting to watch modern Mormons all over the globe. In the global South, in Europe, in the Pacific Islands, in America, experiment with psychedelics. That seems to be a new thing that even faithful Mormons are embracing. And again, like I said, it's very hard for me to wrap my head around because I didn't interpret the rules that way. But I do think it's an interesting issue that the church is probably going to have to, talk about. And if not, it'll be interesting to see how it expresses itself.
Yeah. Lindsay Hansen Park, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Christopher Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.